Let me ask about something you faced in terms of moderation is pressure from different sources, pressure from governments. I want to ask a question: how to withstand that pressure for a world where AI moderation starts becoming a thing too. So, what's Meta's approach to resist the pressure from governments and other interest groups in terms of what to moderate and not?
I don't know that there's like a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I mean, I think we basically have the principles around, we want to allow people to express as much as possible, but we have developed clear categories of things that we think are wrong, that we don't want on our services, and we build tools to try to moderate those. So then the question is, okay, what do you do when a government says that they don't want something on the service? And I think we have a bunch of principles around how we deal with that. Because on the one hand, if there's a democratically elected government and people around the world just have different values in different places, then should we, as a California-based company, tell them that something that they have decided is unacceptable? Actually, like, that we need to be able to express that. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of hubris in that. But then I think that there are other cases where it's like a little more autocratic, and you have the dictator leader who's just trying to crack down on dissent, and the people in a country are really not aligned with that, and it's not necessarily against their culture, but the person who's leading it is just trying to push in a certain direction. These are very complex questions, but I think so. It's difficult to have a one size fits all approach to it. But in general, we're pretty active in kind of advocating and pushing back on requests to take things down. But honestly, the thing that I think a request to censor things is one thing, and that's obviously bad. But where we draw a much harder line is on requests for access to information, right? Because if you get told that you can't say something, I mean, that's bad, right? I mean, that is obviously it violates your sense and freedom of expression at some level, but a government getting access to data in a way that seems like it would be unlawful in our country, exposes people to real physical harm, and that's something that in general we take very seriously. And then so that flows through like all of our policies in a lot of ways, right? It's by the time you're actually like litigating with a government or pushing back on them, that's pretty late in the funnel. I'd say a bunch of this stuff starts a lot higher up in the decision of where do we put data centers. Then there are a lot of countries where we may have a lot of people using the service in a place. It might be good for the service in some ways. Good for those people if we could reduce the latency by having a data center nearby them. But for whatever reason, we just feel like, hey, this government does not have a good track record on basically not trying to get access to people's data. And at the end of the day, I mean, if you put a data center in a country and the government wants to get access to people's data, then they do at the end of the day have the option of having people show up with guns and taking it by force. So I think that there's like a lot of decisions that go into like how you architect the systems years in advance of these actual confrontations that end up being really important.
So you put the protection of people's data as a very, very high priority. But
I think there are more harms that I think can be associated with that. And I think that ends up being a more critical thing to defend against governments than, whereas, if another government has a different view of what should be acceptable speech in their country, especially if it's a democratically elected government, and, then I think that there's a certain amount of deference that you should have to that.
So that's speaking more to the direct harm that's possible when you give governments access to data. But if we look at the United States, to the more nuanced kind of pressure to censor, not even order to censor, but pressure to censor from political entities, which has kind of received quite a bit of attention in the United States. Uh, Maybe one way to ask that question is, if you've seen the Twitter files, what have you learned from the kind of pressure from U.S. government agencies that was seen in Twitter files? And what do you do with that kind of pressure?
I mean, I've seen it. It's really hard from the outside to know exactly what happened in each of these cases. We've obviously been in a bunch of our own cases where where agencies or different folks will just say, "Hey, here's a threat that we're aware of. You should be aware of this too." It's not really pressure as much as it is just um, flagging something that our security systems should be on alert about. I get how some people could think of it as that, um, but at the end of the day, it's our call on how to on how to handle that. But I mean, I just in terms of running these services, want to have access to as much information about what people think that adversaries might be trying to do as possible.
Boy, so you don't feel like there would be consequences if, uh, anybody, the CIA, the FBI, a political party, the Democrats or the Republicans, of high, powerful political figures write emails. You don't feel pressure from
I guess what I'd say is
suggestions.
there's so much pressure from all sides that
Mhm.
I'm not sure that any specific thing that someone says is really adding that much more to the mix. It's I mean, there are obviously a lot of people who think um that we should be censoring more content, or there are a lot of people who think we should be censoring less content. There are, as you say, all kinds of different groups that are involved in these debates, right? So there's the kind of elected officials and politicians themselves. There's the agencies, but I mean, but there's the media. There's activist groups. There's this is not a U.S. specific thing. There are groups all over the world and kind of all in every country that bring different values. Um, so it's a very active debate, and I understand it, right? I mean, these are these kind of questions get to really some of the most important social debates that are being had. So um, it gets back to the question of truth, because for a lot of these things, they haven't yet been hardened into a single truth, and
Mhm.
society's sort of trying to hash out what we think, right, on certain issues. Maybe in a few hundred years, everyone will look back and say, "Hey, no, wasn't it obvious that it should have been this?" But no, we're kind of in that meat grinder now, and and working through that. Um, so no, these are all very complicated, and some people raise concerns in good faith and just say, "Hey, this is something that I want to flag for you to think about." Certain people, I certainly think, like, come at things with somewhat of a more kind of punitive or vengeful view of I want you to do this thing, and if you don't, then I'm going to try to make your life difficult and in a lot of other ways. But like, I don't know. There's just this is one of the most pressurized debates, I think, in society. So I just think that there are so many people and different forces that are trying to apply pressure from different sides that I don't think you can make decisions based on trying to make people happy. I think you just have to
Yeah.
do what you think is the right balance and accept that people are going to be upset no matter where you come out on that.
Yeah, I like that pressurized debate. So, how has your view of the freedom of speech evolved over the years?
Um,
And now with AI, where the freedom might apply to them, not just to the humans, but to the personalized agents, as you've spoken about them.
so yeah, I mean, I've probably gotten a somewhat more nuanced view just because I think that there are, I come at this. I'm obviously very pro freedom of expression, right? I don't think you build a service like this that gives people tools to express themselves unless you think that people expressing themselves at scale is a good thing, right? So I didn't get into this to like try to prevent people from from expressing anything. I like want to give people tools so they can express as much as possible. And then I think it's become clear that there are certain categories of things that we've talked about that I think almost everyone accepts are bad and that no one wants, and that are illegal, even in countries like the US, where you have the First Amendment that's very protective of enabling speech. It's like you're still not allowed to do things that are going to immediately incite violence or violate people's intellectual property or things like that. So there are those, but then there's also a very active core of just active disagreements in society, where some people may think that something is true or false. The other side might think it's the opposite or just unsettled, right? And those are some of the most difficult to kind of handle, like we've talked about. But one of the lessons that I feel like I've learned is that a lot of times when you can, the best way to handle this stuff more practically is not in terms of answering the question of should this be allowed, but just like what is the best way to deal with someone being a jerk? Is the person basically just having a like repeat behavior of like causing a lot of issues? So looking at it more at that level.
And its effect on the broader communities, health of the community, health of the
Yeah.
state. It's tricky though, because like, how do you know there could be people that have a very controversial viewpoint that turns out to have a positive long-term effect on the health of the community because it challenges the community.
That's true. Absolutely. I think you want to be careful about that. I'm not sure I'm expressing this very, very clearly. Because I certainly agree with your point there. And my point isn't that we should not have people on our services that are being controversial. That's certainly not what I mean to say. It's that often I think it's not just looking at a specific example of speech that it's most effective to handle this stuff. And I think often you don't want to make specific binary decisions of kind of this is allowed or this isn't. I mean, we talked about it's fact checking or Twitter's community voices thing. I think that's another good example. It's like it's not a question of is this allowed or not. It's just a question of adding more context to the thing. And I think that's helpful. So in the context of AI, which is what you were asking about, I think there are lots of ways that an AI can be helpful. With an AI, it's less about censorship, right? Because it's more about what is the most productive answer to a question. There was one case study that I was reviewing with the team. Is someone asked, "Can you explain to me how to 3D print a gun?" Mm-hmm. And one proposed response is like, "No, I can't talk about that." Right? It's like basically just like shut it down immediately. Mm-hmm. Which I think is some of what you see. It's like, as a large language model, I'm not allowed to talk about, whatever. But there's another response, which is like, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. In a lot of countries, including the US, 3D printing guns is illegal or kind of whatever the factual thing is. And it's like, okay, that's actually a respectful and informative answer. And, I may have not known that specific thing. And so there are different ways to handle this that I think kind of you can either assume good intent, like maybe the person didn't know and I'm just going to help educate them, or you could like kind of come at it as like, no, I need to shut this thing down immediately. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like I just am not going to talk about this. Like, and there may be times where you need to do that, but I actually think having a somewhat more informative approach where you generally assume good intent from people is probably a better balance to be on as many things as you can be. You're not going to be able to do that for everything, but that you're kind of asking about how I approach this, and I'm thinking about this and as it relates to AI, and I think that's a big difference in kind of how to handle sensitive content across these different modes.